Ave! Today you're in for a special episode straight from the full version of Europa Universalis 5. Yes, the wait is over. That's thanks to Paradox for sponsoring this episode, for which I'm truly grateful. So this isn't my opinion and it's not a review, it's pure gameplay. You can draw your own conclusions. Expect more content starting from November 2nd. In this episode, I'll be guiding the fate of Castile through 300 years of gameplay. This means you'll get to see aspects of the game such as war, diplomacy, colonization, building trade routes, and a powerful economy. My ultimate goal is to create an empire upon which the sun never sets. Excited? I am, so let's begin. I also have a small favor to ask. If you're planning to buy Europa Universalis 5 or any Paradox game, I'd really appreciate it if you used my affiliate link. In your cart, you should see a message confirming that the affiliate link has been activated. I'm a small full-time YouTube creator, and honestly, the income from these kinds of affiliate links is a huge help for my household budget, allowing me to keep creating content without worrying about tomorrow. Castile, under the rule of King Alfonso XI, is definitely one of the most powerful nations. It's a country thoroughly polished by Paradox with plenty of dynamic events and extra content. Castile begins with the legacy of the Reconquista, so that additional morale will help me handle a few nearby matters. However, Castile's greatest strength lies in its naval and colonial bonuses, and I won't hesitate to use them. A beautiful country. It has only one problem. A ridiculous number of forts which I have to demolish. Let's get to it. Much better already. Especially for the budget, and since I'm here, I'll raise taxes for all estates. Except the clergy, of course, because as we know, priests don't pay. Expenses for my court, as high as possible. That's because I want to grant a few privileges to the social estates to collect even higher taxes. Especially privileges for the burghers, so they can effectively develop Castile, for the clergy, to better support the fight against the infidels. Peasants, I'm taking away their privilege, because who's ever heard of peasants having the right to land? That's some strange Western European invention. However, this decision has destabilized the situation in my country. Therefore, first I granted the peasants the right to sit in parliament, and second, I'll have Francesco take care of improving Castile's stability. Unfortunately, I'm missing the resource needed to mint my own coins. Luckily, Castile has silver, and in two different locations, so I'm expanding both of those mines. I also have the process of moving the capital ahead of me, not because I don't know how to pronounce its name, because, of course, you know I have excellent diction. It's just that my royal authority in this location is quite limited by the mountains. Relocating the administration requires a lot of books, so I'm expanding the scriptoria. Time to deal with trade. I'll let someone more competent than me handle that. As for rivals, I'm choosing Morocco, Tlemcen and Tunis because war is coming. That's why disbanding the army might seem like a bad idea, but I want my levies to be supported by heavy cavalry. The rivalry from Portugal caught me a bit off guard, since the Castilian king's wife is a Portuguese princess who used to be first in line to the throne. Unfortunately, the king of Portugal, Afonso IV, changed the order of succession, and now Pedro is the heir. But I have a feeling he might not live very long, so I've sent my diplomats to Portugal to assess the mood there. Additionally, I began improving relations with both England and France, since I haven't yet decided whom to support in their upcoming conflict. My son Pedro, apparently a very popular name in Iberia, has grown up enough that I can assign him a much more expensive tutor. It's not worth saving money on the education of a future ruler. Roughly a year into the campaign, I moved the capital to Toledo, which for the moment hurt my budget quite a bit. But thanks to those two rivers, soon my control will extend over a much larger part of the country. In the year 39, it was time for the first National Assembly, here called the Cortes. It will take place in Toledo, as I want to strengthen central authority. Because in Castile's national values, there's currently a slight lean towards decentralization. So I'll use this assembly to carry out some legal reforms with the help of the nobility. I'll soon promise them something in exchange for changing Castile's administrative system to one that suits me better. Centralization. Yes, once again, I have to promise them something. Unfortunately, in August of 1341, the Portuguese king died and Pedro took the throne. Sadly, my spies weren't yet ready to act, so I had to take a more direct approach and use my claim to the throne. Well, technically Maria's claim, but it's basically mine. Unfortunately, Portugal and Castile have good relations, so this will cause some social unrest. But I'm ready to make that sacrifice. Just not that big of a sacrifice. Oh no, Paradox. Let me note that I'm using a pre-release version, and yes, I've just reported this bug. Anyway, I gathered my levies, and during the war I faced a very important choice. The Renaissance had begun and I had to decide which path to take for this era. In the end I led Castile toward administrative development so the Castilian people could read better and suffer less from the costs of distance from the capital. Besides, Spain without Deus Vult isn't really Spain. Back to the war with Portugal. First I decided to strike at the Navarrese army, since they were much smaller. Though they fought bravely, they were ultimately crushed. Then Portuguese armies appeared in the west of my territory, but before attacking my troops needed to rest. The Spanish army is definitely the fiercer one though. Thanks to that, it quickly broke the right flank, leading to victory in battle. Eventually, near Najera, I completely destroyed Navarre's forces. And just when my troops reached the outskirts of Lisbon after many victorious battles, it turned out that Portugal surrendered and I could establish a personal union over the country and even make some profit from it. Then, as usual, I improved relations. I'll begin work on the legal act of the personal union in 5 years. If you're curious, Pedro survived, though maybe not for long, since a great epidemic is approaching. That's why I've started building the first hospitals. There was no point in saving, the hospitals had to be built, and of course I financed it by minting more coins. Hospitals could only be built in cities, so I started with those in southern Spain. After some time I had to begin importing large quantities of glass, since hospital construction required a lot of it, and unfortunately the Black Death arrived in Spain. It caused severe destabilization across the country. By this point, the plague had already claimed 2.5 million lives, so I didn't hesitate. I made even tougher decisions, like isolating the country and segregating the infected. Yes, everything's fine. It all started in Seville. Then, in less than 2 years, it spread rapidly across nearly all of Iberia, claiming almost 2 million more lives, and sadly neither foreign aid nor the toughest decisions could stop it. The only thing the Castilian king could do was put his faith in God and in the Pope. The plague caused such terror among the Portuguese nobility that they formally requested to solidify the personal union under Castile, even though Portugal was actually faring better than Castile. I had no choice but to agree to remain the senior partner of Portugal. In the year 1350, after 3 years of devastation, death finally left Castile's borders. That same year, the Castilian prince finally came of age, ready for marriage, and it just so happened that England had 2 unmarried princesses. Unfortunately, they were quite far down the line of succession. Although I must admit, it might be worth waiting for the French princess, since she's third in line to the throne. And speaking of dynastic ties, look at what the King of Naples has done. He is now simultaneously the King of Naples, Croatia, Hungary and Poland, all thanks to some very smart marriages. Ultimately, I decided to postpone the matter of my heir's marriage. It's a strategic decision for Castile, after all. For the next few years, I'll focus on economic affairs. First of all, I begin with all actions that increase population growth in Spain, as well as restore prosperity. Some villages, especially in the south, have become heavily depopulated, so I can build residential settlements there. Each of them increases population growth. And after building them, I must address Castile's second greatest problem, the poor distribution of population. Most people live in the north and I want to move them to the south. Therefore, I order my ministers to discourage people from settling in such areas and at the same time to encourage settlement around the capital. Because here too, there are almost empty villages and population flows can be quite large. Next, I begin the process of urbanizing villages around the capital. This requires gigantic amounts of wood, so new lumber camps must be built. Technology that reduces the cost of founding new cities will also come in handy. As for marriage, it was worth the wait. My daughter Constance takes the King of France as her husband. To also solve Castile's problems with access to gold, I decided to fund an expedition to the northern coast of Africa under the command of Captain Sylvester. And after a year of preparations, the expedition set off. In the meantime, I managed to secure a union over Portugal by codifying the process of inheritance. Since many new cities and many new roads have been built, now bridges must be constructed to open up travel to Seville. Meanwhile, the expedition encounters some difficulties, and ultimately I discovered the northern coast of Africa. Riding on that success, I will fund an expedition to the western coast. In the 100 Years' War, France also began to gain a slight advantage. Therefore, I decided to form an alliance with them. It's time to unite the treasury with Portugal. After developing city-building technology, founding cities became much cheaper. And unfortunately, the Franco-Papal War broke out. It is precisely the war over Avignon. To be honest, I didn't really want to get involved because it wasn't my war, so I ordered my army to fight battles in those regions, and I myself returned to building cities, since they had already sprung up around the capital, and the next step was construction southward, toward the second river. This should steadily improve my ruler's control, and by taking all these steps, I managed to shift Castilian values from decentralization decidedly toward the centralization of power. Now no one can stop me, at least that's what I hope. The next thing I want to do is make Castile a much more innovative country. Unfortunately, the conflict between the Pope and France deepened so much that it led to a schism in the Catholic Church. And in this conflict, I ultimately supported France. Eventually, the first conflict between the Pope and France ended with France's victory. The Pope himself had to relinquish part of his territory and dismantle the forts in Avignon. What do they say? Long live the new king! The old one, sadly, died at the age of 60, so he did not burden the Castilian treasury with his pension, but he was a great ruler. So great, in fact, that Pedro developed some complexes because of it, and Pedro's mood swings didn't help with that. The nation began to lose confidence in the authority of the Castilian crown, and the madness deepened. And soon, the first synod in Paris was about to take place, because France had gained much greater support than the Pope. In the year 86, Gambia was discovered, a market where there was a lot of cheap gold. Oh no, that market is still out of my reach. I need the banking institution, because with it, I can discover distant markets and extend my trade range. Unfortunately, I'm still very far from introducing this institution, since we have exactly zero of it. I will leave control over the Inquisition in the hands of the Pope. I also missed the first synod because I was busy with affairs in Africa. I missed the next assemblies as well. Unfortunately, the first institution I was able to introduce was the professional army. That led to the possibility of researching the armory, the first military building, as well as the Center for Voluntary Compulsory Labor Recruitment. It was also a good moment to finally deal with the matter of Granada, still under the reign of Pedro the Mad. To this end, I asked Parliament to prepare war claims, preferably for the most populous province. Alright, but seriously, I should have had an event that mobilizes the Castilian nobility to conquer Granada. And I didn't. This campaign is a bit unlucky. The year 93 is a very important year, because it marks exactly 50 years since the establishment of the personal union over Portugal. And that means I can now begin the processes leading toward unification. Portugal doesn't have much to say in the matter. It's also an important year because I begin my invasion of Granada. True, the enemy is much stronger, but as if I couldn't handle that, all the more since I can call France into this war. Besides, Portugal is on my side too, as it is, after all, a loyal union. I gathered the levies and my army near Cordoba, then I sent them toward the capital of Granada, and my Castilian fleet caught the Moroccan one and crushed it without much trouble. The war was going fine until Morocco called in its allies, then the armies of Tlemcen even reached France. Yes, I'll have to deal with that. And so I did, even though the armies of Tlemcen had a lot of cavalry, Granada conquered, Tlemcen's forces crushed, time to prepare for an invasion of Morocco. The fleet was very important here, as it had to supply my army with food. Relief arrived at the last moment. My forces in Morocco were this close to being destroyed. Fortunately, the Moroccans didn't manage it. At sea, my fleet won battle after battle without much difficulty. During this war, King Pedro died. I hope his successor won't be as mad. I am really keeping my fingers crossed, because improving legitimacy was costing me thousands of gold. After more than a year-long siege, I captured Alaras. However, it was a very costly siege. 3,000 souls will remain there forever. Ultimately, from Morocco, I seized their last Iberian possessions, as well as a gigantic amount of gold. As for all of Granada, I take it for myself. I had to integrate the conquered territories, and for that I appointed my best advisors. Unfortunately, this process will still take a very long time. The population from the conquered lands of Granada, unfortunately, is fleeing. That's because Andalusian and Castilian cultures are hostile to one another. Right after our war with Granada, the 100 Years' War between France and England ended. Finally, peace. The current heir to the Castilian throne is a true genius. I won't spare any expense on his education. To speed up the process of introducing institutions, I'll start building libraries everywhere. I also sponsored the construction of a large number of monasteries in the territories of Granada. Next, I might build a few cathedrals here, because both buildings speed up the conversion of infidels to the one true faith. The schism has also ended. Did I really miss all the synods? And it was such a good moment to reform the religion. No matter, at least I'll finally introduce banking now in Castile. Therefore now I must change my entire research queue. although I'll still keep the upgrade for the levy army for later. Then merchants and trade, because that increases the range of everything. And then distant markets. The counting house is also a very useful building as it increases crown authority wherever it's built. I don't know why it requires so much gold. And then everything should go toward increasing literacy in the country. Although I must admit, my research pace is already incredibly strong. And soon after, a union was formed over Austria thanks to that archduchess who is the wife of the Spanish king. This means Pedro will inherit all those countries, and Austria will simply join the Castilian Union. They'll say again that it's a typical Lookas game, collecting unions all over Europe. Pedro has finally come of age, he will hold many titles. Wow, an outstanding figure. And I finally researched range, but that's still not enough. Then I won't get gold from Mali. Well, at least in 1417 I can finally introduce the Renaissance in Castile. And at last, Pedro II ascended the throne, ruler of Castile, Portugal and Austria. Alright, his mother has to die first, but either way he'll get Austria. For now, he should focus on expanding the regular army. And at the same time take the first colonial actions. Granted, those colonies won't form very quickly, but it's still progress. 1000 cavalry prepared. I think it's worth subjugating Navarre now. Yes, cavalry is strong, especially when the opponent is smaller. For my smaller army, I'm recruiting Hofknights. They'll be useful for bombarding forts that this army will capture. It always speeds up the siege process a bit. And with my larger army, to which I have assigned professional cavalry, I march to destroy the enemy's forces. How pleasant when the English troops arrived and forgot to bring food supplies. Because of that, I could inflict massive losses on them, and after defeating the English, I managed to occupy all of Navarre. The Basque culture is a tolerated one, but it would be wise to improve their attitude toward us. That's why I'm restoring the Kingdom of Navarre. Not as a vassal, but as Castilian lands. Thanks to this, Pedro rules this country, which, by the way, has just begun the next stage of city expansion. This time along the rivers. The time for unification has also come. Because the situation in Castile has finally become stable, namely the unification of the two Castilian markets. Because I don't know why there should be two markets for one country. It would be better if Castilian merchants focused on foreign markets. So first, I destroyed the Burgos market. This caused the Seville market to shrink temporarily. But only temporarily. Because now I'm moving the trade capital to Toledo, it's perfectly in the center. The unification of the market resulted in the creation of a single gigantic Toledo market. And the treasury income is now greater than ever before. In the year 28, the Castilian government was reformed with a national assembly, which was a very innovative approach. Unfortunately, Pedro's mother, the Archduchess of Austria, died, and thus I received Austria. Another title for Pedro's collection. Unfortunately, this union could end after Pedro's death. Therefore, an Austrian National Assembly was convened where the nobility was bribed. That is to say, persuaded to support unification with Castile, with quite a number of convincing arguments. And it worked. Ultimately, the bribed Austrian parliament passed and adopted all the laws of the Castilian Union. And so came January of the year 1437. Which means the Age of Discovery had begun. A very important era for the Castilian kingdom, for it was time to set out and explore the New World if such a thing even existed. And I must admit, during this era I hope to finally reach Mali. Although before that, the institution of the New World would have to appear first. It was also a very important year as the first overseas Castilian possessions were established, the Azores, which for now shall remain under the direct authority of the crown. But the institution of the New World itself appeared in Almeria, which is also within Castile. Meanwhile, a new military thought emerged in Krakow. The Age of Discovery is a time when I would need a great many sailors, so I began heavily investing in the development of coastal cities. I also began preparations for an invasion of Jolof to establish a Castilian trading foothold there. Spies were already preparing a good cause for war, and in 47 Castile became a great power. Is the world ready for that? Unfortunately, that didn't mean I had a long way to go, but at last it was time to establish the first Castilian domains in Africa. Jolof stood little chance in this war, and yet the Jolofian troops set an ambush for my landing army. In the end, I won, though it was a bloody battle. I decided to place the entire region directly under the authority of the crown. I also sent a dedicated fleet there to mark the presence of Castilian power. This in the near future could positively affect my trading strength, and unfortunately, despite my efforts, the market of Mali still remained out of reach for Castilian merchants, and the institution of the New World, for some reason, refused to spread. Therefore, I wanted to take another radical step and prepared for war with Morocco. Fortunately, moving the army across was not a major problem. During the war with Morocco, the Spanish Inquisition was established, and I decided to follow the historical path here. which should come as a surprise to everyone, since nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. I used the Inquisition to convert the remaining Andalusian population to Catholicism. The protests achieved nothing. Returning to the war with Morocco, I had a massive advantage in the size of my army, which allowed me to quickly capture Morocco's capital, Fez, which ultimately became the main objective of my conquest. Since integrating these provinces would take decades, I decided to establish the county of Fez there. As a result, I couldn't immediately benefit from that market as an intermediary route to Mali, but that time will come. For now, however, I reformed the Spanish currency, introducing the Spanish dollar based on silver and gold. Thanks to this move, the Spanish coffers began to fill. And just at that same moment, gold from Mali finally began to flow into Lisbon, and from there to Spain. A beautiful sight. I had worked long to see it. Just as I had to wait a long time for the introduction of that institution, almost 40 years. A few years later, I developed overseas trade, so now gold could flow directly from Mali to Toledo. And all in all, that coastline became the most important trade center for Castile. And I won't hide it, a thought crossed my mind, maybe I should conquer it for myself. But this era is called the Age of Discovery for a reason. I began overseas exploration. Soon after, I sent out the first oceanic expeditions, practically all I could. And not even 10 years later, I discovered proof of the New World's existence, which brought many benefits to my Castile. First, I discovered the coast of South America and Brazil. Soon after, I reached the shores of the Caribbean, and the thought of an unknown land drew more and more adventurers. One of them was Fernando Cortés. It was also a period in which Castile underwent great changes. The royal council was reformed, weakening the power of the nobility. The royal authority had never been so strong, and also truly centralized. Soon after, the first expeditions of brave settlers set out for the Caribbean. The native population might not survive this, as a great plague broke out, beginning the devastation of both Americas. Yes, death was coming. The colonial boom was so great that a special organization was established in Castile, specifically in Seville. Further advancements were developed and the conquest of primitive peoples became possible. I organized more and more expeditions, though they grew longer and longer. Some could now last even 10 years. The Castilian treasury also funded the creation of many new colonies. The people of Seville migrated in every possible direction. This opened opportunities to access new markets and money flowed into the treasury. And as Castile grew richer, Western Europe entered yet another crisis. A crisis of faith caused by Martin Luther. The words of such a heretic as Martin Luther would find no place in Spain. Meanwhile, while the colonization of the Caribbean islands continued, I decided to launch another attack, this time a war with the Mali Empire. All in order to seize control of that market, from which immense quantities of gold, ivory and diamonds flowed. The new African territories would surely help in that effort, especially those in Central Africa. After capturing Mali's territories, I received a proposal to launch an expedition to find a new route to India under the leadership of Magellan, for the experience gained from it would accelerate all the others. After many years, Catalan culture was accepted within Castile's territory, making them now an integral part of the kingdom. Unfortunately, Castile wasn't the only one setting out toward the New World. England did so as well. To avoid any misunderstandings arising from this, a proposal was made to divide the world in half. I will invite English representatives to Toledo for negotiations. At this moment, the English want North America, while I claim South America and Africa. But here I have room to negotiate this treaty. At the same time, I discovered powerful empires located in Mesoamerica. And to be honest, I don't see those empires having suffered much from the plague. There was also a proposal to move the capital to Madrid, but I am quite comfortable in Toledo, though I did invest somewhat in developing this region in the meantime. Toledo is now one of the richest capitals in the world, it surpasses Paris, and London is not even half as wealthy. Returning to the treaties, I will now claim rights simply to the territories where I established colonies. Moreover, colonial expenditures are increasing significantly. In the colonies, the most important thing is to build settlements for new arrivals, so that their population may grow. In the year 1528, I encountered a certain problem that hindered the building of my trade empire. Everywhere, on all my markets, there was a shortage of paper, and funding new workshops was very costly and time-consuming. Without paper, trading offices were less efficient and transactions couldn't be recorded. The Treaty of Toledo was signed. And I am a master negotiator, for I agreed with myself that the entire world belongs to me, though in truth, England changed its faith to Protestantism just before signing the treaty. Which means the entire Catholic world would not recognize the treaty anyway. So, quite unfortunately, I entered the Age of Reformation, a time when I would also focus on diplomacy, and my cabinet would now function more efficiently. The Council of Trent had also begun, during which reforms of the Catholic Church were debated, but more importantly, the Church's stance toward heresy, which was spreading effectively. Meanwhile, I discovered a powerful Mayan empire in Central America, which could pose a threat to my newly established colonies. But first, I had to develop better military units. I admit I had somewhat neglected that matter earlier. I think Castilian lancers will come in handy. This era also brought new concepts of trade, rather opposing ones: mercantilism and free trade. I believe the Castilian market must be protected. The Council of Trent ended with certain reforms and the declaration that heresy must not be tolerated under any circumstances. All good, but what are these sheep doing here? The Castilian army was also modernized. Halberdiers, Castilian lancers and larger cannons. With this preparation, the army was soon to depart for the New World, to conquer the Mayan Empire. Meanwhile, the port of Seville became one of the largest trade centers. In the year 1550, Portugal was annexed and became an integral part of Castile. That map looks quite nice now. But more importantly, I could finally form the Kingdom of Spain, which would grant me access to several unique advancements. Though, to be honest, I don't really like this color. It also turned out that Portuguese territories were not very developed. There were many towns, but literally only one true city. With the massive influx of gold into the Kingdom of Spain, the Spanish dollar proved to be a very valuable currency. 10 years later, Spanish armies stood at the borders of the Mayan Empire. I had full intelligence on them. I knew exactly where their forces were stationed. Their armies were numerous, but against the modernized Spanish army, they stood little chance. I won battle after battle. Even though the fighting was fierce, Castilian forces suffered practically no losses, or rather their losses were 10 times smaller than those of the Mayans. It also turned out that my opponent's fortresses were very primitive, poorly garrisoned, easy targets for an assault. The heart of the Mayan Empire became the beginning of a Spanish colony. Nearly 2 million people settled in that area. But more importantly, the riches of the New World began flooding Europe. Combined with the new monetary policy, this allowed for the expansion of the entire road network in Spain. The revenues flowing into the Spanish treasury had never been so high, and they kept growing as trade continued to flourish. The Spanish kingdom was so magnificent that it became a hegemon economically, militarily, and culturally. Such a vast empire required a much larger fleet as well as further conquests from the Mayan Empire. The next conquests were so extensive that I had to establish a colonial state there. It might not be the most profitable in terms of direct income, but it would contribute its share to trade. And so, the Viceroyalty of New Spain was created, to which I transferred the greater part of the conquered territories. But the heart of the former Mayan Empire remained mine. This allowed me to resolve administrative issues while maintaining enormous trade revenues. Ahead of me lay further conquests of other tribes, and yet another colonial boom. Perhaps I even overdid it a little. The power and wealth of Spain were so immense that they deserved a new palace. The Palace of El Escorial. Beautiful, isn't it? It would greatly strengthen the power of the crown. I also founded the Royal Tobacco Factory and changed Spain's flag. But seriously, what happened here? It used to be like this, and now it's like that. Sadly, at the moment when I was already on the best way to discover India, because they were already within my reach. Besides, I had already discovered Indian colonies that were right next to my holdings in Safi. A lot of rebellions broke out and more were still on the way. So I decided that in the New World I already needed a permanent garrison, preferably made mostly of Spanish lancers. And truthfully, I must admit that wars in the New World do not necessarily go my way. So in the end, I prepared a much larger army than I had planned. And after a very long journey, the cavalry arrived. Literally. That kind of force proved to be much more effective because first of all, it was not weighed down by artillery and it moved quickly. And looking at the losses I began to inflict, it was rather a good decision. Unfortunately, the reinforcements arrived too late and I lost part of the colonies. Therefore, I decided on radical moves. First, I released many more viceroyalties because managing such a territory alone is very hard. Second, I began fortifying the more populous locations because taking European-style forts will be a problem for the opponent. And basically that tactic worked because a few years later I retook the lost territories. Between us, don't tell anyone, but conquering that area is much harder than in EU4, which is visible from the fact that taking most of that territory took me another 30 years. Altogether, probably about 50. So if taking territory where about 15 million people lived is so hard, what awaits me in India, where each single country here has that much population? But I knew it was a game worth the candle. You only had to look at India's riches, which of course must belong to Spain. Because honestly, every Indian market is richer than any of my markets. So I began preparations to be able to create a bigger army. Building barracks in Toledo cost literally tens of thousands of gold, and my finger was really about to fall off. Yes, I didn't notice the note that you have to hold shift. I also began preparing new armies composed of the most modern giant guns, Castilian lancers, and the core of the army would be the Spanish tercio, which is incredibly strong for this era. And supply wagons, I can't forget those in India. And just so it's clear that while taking Mesoamerica, I wasn't doing nothing else, at the same time I was colonizing South America. France got a bit involved here, I also took Madagascar, but more importantly, I established bases in the Maldives. Moreover, my discoveries further east also progressed nicely. I discovered the powerful Majapahit Empire, the Great Suzhou, and the Khmer Empire, with which I will now wage war, because I need to seize territories in Ceylon. I am interested in that territory because there is a lot of population there, and it also belongs to that market whose name I will not pronounce. But dominating it could cause my budget to increase by as much as 2,000, especially thanks to pepper, whose production here is gigantic and demand is also high. But if Spain is first on that list, most of the pepper will go to Europe. In the end, this war turned out a bit bigger than I thought, but my fleet is already arriving. In a moment my troops will land, although I see that I have considerable supply problems here. So I stormed and captured that city and set up a logistics point here. Thanks to that, supplies from my fleet will go to that point, and then from that point to my army, so I can move on now. A new era has come, as well as a new golden age of piracy, in which I could start using pirate states to plunder my opponent's territories or fight them. The conquest of Ceylon turned out to be easy, but the war with the Khmers is not over yet. I won't change the fact that I captured very populous locations here, and I will build each and every one of them up to city level. And I continue my war with the Khmers by landing on their territories in Malacca. As soon as I took a few towns, the Khmer army of 60,000 people arrived, and I'll be honest, it looks bad. But, fortunately, I was engaging the Khmer armies one by one. They didn't attack as a group. Because looking at those losses, if all 60,000 troops had attacked me at once, I would have lost those battles. I even won, but the casualties were too comparable. Luckily, capturing the main war objective allowed me to end it quickly and establish a foothold. And a few years later, mainly thanks to the presence of my fleet, I became the second largest player on the Indian market. On my way, of course, to first place as well. I just had to wait until I hired enough merchants. In the meantime, I could start taking advantage of the Colombian exchange. That is importing goods exclusive to the New World into Europe, just as I did in this case with tobacco, provided that the climate conditions allowed for its cultivation. There are quite a lot of such resources, and one of the most valuable and important among them are potatoes. They can be used to make moonshine and provide plenty of food. The age of absolutism is also the era in which two opposing values stand against each other: absolute power and civil liberties. But more importantly, it was also the era in which I managed to achieve the goal of this episode and create an empire upon which the sun never sets. I'll tell you, when I came up with the goal for this episode, I didn't even realize that such an event existed. I managed to create a very wealthy colonial empire based on trade, where the world map ultimately looks roughly like this. And the area of Toledo, located right here, has changed a lot compared to the beginning of the episode. If after what you've seen today, you like Europa Universalis, remember that you can use my link to buy it and support me at the same time. And you can expect more tutorial-style campaigns starting from November 2nd. First of all, though, I encourage you to watch this general beginner's guide, which will be available very soon.